I'm going to be doing a read aloud for you today in this clip, and the reason that I'm doing this read aloud is I want to actually model and demonstrate for you what good thinking looks like when you're trying to make meaning of a text. So when you're doing a subject like cooking or woodwork or any of those sort of things, your teacher will get up the front and they will model and they will demonstrate what it looks like that they want you to do. Unfortunately, it's a bit more difficult to do that when we're talking about thinking. So I'm going to ask you to use your imagination and try and picture that what I'm doing when I'm reading aloud this text is the questions I'm asking out loud are the questions that I'm asking in my head as I'm reading a text. Excerpts from Why I Write, essay by George Orwell, 1946. Okay, so Why I Write, this part here is obviously the title of this text, and I can tell because it is in inverted commas. So I can already see this is going to be about why George Orwell, who's obviously the author, writes. The other thing that's important here is that this is an excerpt, and I know that an excerpt is a little part from a book or something, not the whole text itself, and so they're chosen for a reason. So I've got a question straight away about why did the person who created this text choose the parts that they did? Also, why George Orwell here? Why is this person the author? And how is this going to have any relevance to me? And I know, my teachers told me, I know that we're looking at a book by George Orwell this term. So what he has to say about why he writes might help me understand a little bit about him. From a very early age, perhaps the age of 5 or 6, I knew that when I grew up I should be a writer. Between the ages of about 17 and 24, I tried to abandon this idea, but I did so with the consciousness, so consciousness means thinking, so that I was outraging my true nature. Outraging my true nature, what does that mean? Upsetting my true nature, so that's against his true nature. So he thought about the fact it was against he did it while he was aware of the fact it was against his true nature. But I did so being aware of the fact that I was doing this against my true nature and that sooner or later I should have to settle down and write books. So he knew it was inevitable that he was going to have to write books. So if I think about this whole paragraph, the big question here is, what does the author want me to understand from telling me this? And basically he wants me to understand that he was really young when he knew that he was going to be a writer, so it's always been inside him, and he tried to not do it, but even when he tried not to do it, he actually knew that was to not write was going against what his true nature was, and that it was writing books was something he would actually just have to do, and nothing could stop that. Okay, I get it. I was the middle child of 3, but there was a gap of 5 years on either side, and I barely saw my father before I was 8. For this, and for other reasons, I was somewhat lonely. Somewhat is interesting because that qualifies how lonely he was, so he didn't... Maybe that means he wasn't extremely lonely. And I soon developed disagreeable mannerisms which made me unpopular throughout my school days. I had the lonely child's habit of making up stories and holding conversations with imaginary persons, and I think that from the very start my literary ambitions were mixed up with the feeling of being isolated and undervalued. Losing a bit of meaning here, but I'm going to read on and then see if I can make sense of it. I knew that I had a facility with words, so he knew he could write well, and a power of facing unpleasant facts. And I felt that this created a sort of private world in which I could get my own back for my failure in everyday life. So his failure in everyday life links to the fact he was unpopular and he had disagreeable mannerisms. So he had, because he was lonely, he had little things he would do that made him unpopular with other kids. And I guess it's interesting here that this key word is lonely. So because he was lonely, he made up stories. And by telling me that his literary ambitions are mixed up with this feeling of being isolated and undervalued is part of telling me why he writes. So, which is the title. I think the big question here is, why is the author telling me this? And the answer to that is that he's telling me all of this so that I will understand what it was like for him. And by painting this picture of this lonely school child who we can actually connect with, that we've either seen or been, is actually connecting me with that understanding who he really is. Okay, this straight away tells me that something's been left out here. These 3 dots, ellipses. When I was about 16, I suddenly discovered the joy of mere words, i.e. the sounds and associations of words. The lines from Paradise Lost. I remember Paradise Lost. I read it at university and it was a really, really, really hard text to read, but it's considered a classic. And I also think that it's something like it's an allegory. Okay, so this is the bit from Paradise Lost. So he, it's 2 E's in here, with difficulty and labour hard, moved on. With difficulty and labour, he. Which do not now seem to me so very wonderful. So he doesn't think that they're that good now. But then they sent shivers down my backbone, and he's used a semicolon here. So it's another idea he wants to connect to that idea. And the spelling of he, this makes sense now, for he was an added pleasure. So he did really take pleasure in playing with words, like he said. As for the need to describe things, I knew all about it already, so it is clear what kind of books I wanted to write, insofar as I could be said to want to write books at that time. I wanted to write enormous, naturalistic, so natural style novels with unhappy endings. So I find that interesting. Unhappy endings, full of detailed descriptions and arresting similes. I know what similes are. It's when you compare something to something. And full of purple passages. Purple passages. That's that idea of purple prose. What I remember about purple prose was that it's actually like a criticism. It's when things are too ornate and too descriptive. Maybe I can check on that. In which words were used partly for the sake of their own sound. And in fact, my first completed novel, Burmese Days, which I wrote when I was 30, but projected much earlier. What does that mean? But projected much earlier is rather that kind of book. So did he start writing it much earlier? He wrote it when he was 30, but he started like the story for it or the beginnings of it for himself was possibly, I think. Okay. So I actually have a lot of information here that I need to work out. Sort of 2 main questions that I want to ask the author here. I want to ask, what he's actually telling me. And what he's actually telling me is the sort of books he wants to write and why. And the reason he wants to write books full of all these similes and purple prose and purple passages rather and unhappy endings and all this stuff is because that's the sort of stuff he likes to read. So that's how it links up to his stuff here about what he felt about Paradise Lost. And then that actually links in if we look at things like the spelling. So now we're thinking about what literary techniques does he use. We could think he's got, it's like alliteration in here, sent shivers down my backbone, which is imagery. He's trying to produce mental pictures so that we can feel what he felt, to understand what he's saying. So I guess the main thing I'm getting from this is that reinforcement of the idea that he really loved words and the way they sound and the way they work and the way you put them together. And what happens when you do that. Alright, so now I want to think about all of those questions that came up while I was reading, and I've got three main questions. I've got, what is the author telling me? What does the author want me to understand? And how does the author tell me? So the answer to the first one is pretty simple, I think. He's actually telling me why he writes. That's the whole purpose of this essay, why he writes. Then I come to, what does the author want me to understand? And that's a bit more complex because he wants me to understand why he writes, but more than that, he wants me to really get it. He wants me to understand how there's a strong link between his loneliness as a child and the way that affected him. So there's strange characteristics that he had, and his need to write. So that link between those two things. But he also wants me to understand that this strong passion that he had for writing, that writing was something that he had to do, and that he has a passion for words. So now the third question I want to think about is, how does the author tell me? So now we look at this final question, which is, how does he tell me? And when I think about it, I think of things like the way he repeated that word lonely several times in the first bit to show that this was really important. So he uses repetition by doing that. He tells me how much he loves words by showing me a passage he loved and giving me an example of how he enjoyed playing with the spelling of words. But he also uses a lot of alliteration, which right throughout that section in particular, which reinforces the idea that he loves the sound of words. And he's also used imagery to help me picture and feel what it was that he was describing. So I hope that you can all see now that instead of just reading through, not paying attention to the things that I didn't understand, not trying to work out the things I didn't get, or just reading through the text without trying to take meaning from it, you can see how doing these things has helped me understand that little bit of text much more than I would have if I didn't do the things that I did.